They found his body floating in a cistern, headless, nameless, and without explanation. A single gold thread tied around his wrist, buried in the smoldering ashes of a once glorious Roman villa. No sign of forced entry, no leads, and no one in power cared, because he was just a male concubine, a living gift, a plaything of flesh, a tool bought to satisfy the darkest desires of Rome's ruling elite, then discarded like rotted meat the moment he lost his use. His name vanished from every record, his lineage unacknowledged. Even the statue that once bore his likeness, its face was chiseled off, erased. So who was he? Who killed him? And why did the empire go to such lengths to silence his story? Because if the truth ever came to light, it would shatter the divine image of one of Rome's most beloved emperors. This is not the story of a slave. This is a tragedy of power lust, and one of the cruelest betrayals buried in the heart of the Roman Empire. In the first century, AD Rome was not just a place, it was a spectacle of power, brilliant, brutal, and deeply theatrical. After the death of Augustus, the empire was handed to Tiberius, a man known for his caution, his secrecy, and a retreat from public life that stirred more rumors than reforms. Roman society was sharply stratified. Citizens enjoyed rights, prestige, and legal protections. Slaves, on the other hand, were property recorded by value, not name. But in the shadows of both worlds existed a lesser known class, individuals brought into elite households to entertain, to serve, and sometimes to accompany the powerful in private. These companions, often young, often chosen for their beauty, were kept out of history's spotlight. They left behind no titles, few artifacts, and barely a whisper in the archives. Their presence was ornamental, their silence expected, their fate disposable. When Tiberius withdrew to the island of Capri, it marked more than just a political retreat. The emperor left behind the Senate and the spotlight and surrounded himself with a select inner circle. Ancient sources describe Capri as isolated, filled with whispered indulgences and rituals hidden from Roman eyes. What happened there remains the subject of speculation and scandal recorded through the pens of later historians, some biased, some possibly exaggerating, but all pointing to one truth: the emperor built a world where he answered to no one. Among those brought to Capri was a young man from the eastern provinces of the empire. His real name is lost. Some later texts call him Salenus, a name echoing old myths, perhaps given to him for performance, not by birth. Salenus came from a noble but declining family. After losing their estate in a failed conflict, he was sent away, perhaps as payment, perhaps as protection. He was educated in the arts, fluent in both language and music. He was graceful, well trained, and according to one passing mention in a senator's correspondence, unnaturally beautiful. That beauty, however, made him visible to dangerous eyes. He was eventually presented to someone within Tiberius's inner circle and later brought to the emperor's secluded estate. From that moment on, his identity was tied not to family or origin, but to function, a silent participant in a world governed by whim, rank, and secrecy. But Silenus was not content to be invisible. At a time when silence was survival, he chose to speak, to resist quietly, subtly, but unmistakably. And that decision would set into motion a chain of events that not even the emperor in all his power could fully control. The first weeks on Capri blurred like a fever dream. Silenus was shown his quarters, lavish yet windowless, with thick velvet curtains that never parted and oil lamps that never dimmed. Time stopped there. No sunrise, no schedule, only summons. He learned quickly speak only when spoken to, never ask questions, and never forget whose walls you stood within. The others rarely spoke. Some were older eyes dim with resignation. Others were new, silent, suspicious, waiting to see who would vanish next. Their faces were beautiful, impossibly beautiful, but their eyes told another story. Salenus had been trained for elegance, not fear. Yet fear became his companion. It clung to his skin, whispered in the silence between footsteps. Every touch, every look carried weight. He was not beaten. He was not starved. He was simply owned. At first he complied, performed when asked, smiled when needed. But he watched, he listened, and he noticed something most others tried to forget. There were rules behind the madness, a rhythm to the palace. Certain rooms were forbidden. Certain visitors came at night and left pale at dawn. And always, always there were messages slipped under doors, whispered through locked grates, scratched into marble with a thumbnail. Whispers spoke of the archives, a hidden space deep beneath the villa where secrets were kept, documents, letters, recordings, ledgers, not meant to exist. And there it was said was proof of not only what Tiberius did behind closed doors, but who helped him and who he feared. Salenus didn't care for politics. He cared for survival. But survival demanded knowing who could protect you and who could destroy you with a nod. He began building trust with a young scribe named Callias. Not a performer, not a concubine, Callias belonged to a different class, servant scholars, trained to copy scrolls and log inventories. Their paths crossed in the baths, where Callias recited poetry aloud to fill the marble silence. Salenus praised a phrase. Callias smiled. From that moment they exchanged glances, then words, then truths. Callias was cautious, but Salenus was clever. He never asked directly. Instead, he listened, really listened to the spaces between words. One night, Callias said, "Be careful, Salenus. You're not invisible here, but you're not seen either." That's when they strike. The turning point came during a banquet. Salenus was called to serve not food, but ambiance. Dressed in sheer linen and gold cuffs, he stood at the edge of the hall, still as a statue. Senators lounged on cushions. Wine flowed like a river. But Tiberius watched none of it. His eyes stayed fixed on Salenus, and then without signal or announcement, he rose and ordered everyone out. Everyone obeyed, except Salenus. Behind closed doors, the emperor spoke. His voice was soft, almost bored. "They say you have a tongue as sharp as your cheekbones. Let's hope that's not true." Salenus didn't flinch. He didn't bow either. He simply said, "Do they also say, 'I can listen'?" There was a long silence, then a slow, deliberate smile. That night Salenus was no longer invisible. He was known, and that made him dangerous. Over the following weeks, he was summoned more often not for entertainment, but for conversation. Tiberius would speak of politics, of betrayal of gods. He asked Salenus for opinion, and Salenus gave it measured, respectful, but sharp enough to draw blood. This power, however, came at a price. Others noticed. The glances of the household changed, some with awe, others with contempt. Rumors spread Salenus was manipulating the emperor. He was a spy, a lover, a threat. One morning, Callias did not appear at the baths. By evening, his quarters had been stripped clean. No name, no mention, just absence. Salenus asked about him once. The steward's reply was quiet. There never was a Callias. That night, Salenus broke the first rule. He snuck into the lower halls, following a path he'd memorized from overheard conversations. Past locked doors, down stone stairwells, slick with moss until he found a rusted gate, and behind it, shelves upon shelves of wax tablets, sealed scrolls, and ledgers heavy with dust. He found letters coded but unmistakable, names of senators, payments, descriptions of entertainments arranged for visiting diplomats. He found a scroll listing names, first names only, but next to each a mark, a slash, a cross, or a circle. Next to the name Callias, there was only a line, a single cold stroke. He didn't know how long he stood there before he heard it, the soft click of a door behind him. He turned. It was not a guard. It was a woman dressed in the robes of a priestess, but with the bearing of someone far more powerful. "You were never supposed to find this," she said, voice calm. "I wasn't looking for it," Salenus replied. "I was looking for a friend." She paused. Then almost gently, "Then you've already lost." The next day, Salenus was summoned again, this time, not by Tiberius, but by a different voice, a cold one, a voice that recited charges, not requests: treason, subversion, theft of state property. There would be no trial, no hearing, just a cell and the waiting and the knowing that what he uncovered, what he remembered, was enough to bring shame upon more than just a man. It could stain an emperor, and Rome would not allow that. Not then, not ever. The cell was not underground, but it felt like it. No chains, no straw, just stone walls that sweated with the salt of the sea, and silence that pressed in like a fist around the lungs. There was no interrogation, no violence, not at first, just waiting. For days, maybe weeks, he couldn't tell. The oil lamp flickered. The meals came and went with no faces attached. It was the kind of isolation designed not to break the body, but the mind. He remembered the touch of sunlight through silk curtains. He remembered the scent of wine, of parchment, of warm bathwater. He remembered laughter, and then nothing. Salenus lay on the floor counting heartbeats, listening for footsteps that might never come. He had stopped dreaming, but sometimes when he closed his eyes, he saw Callias not as he was, but as he might have been, smiling, free. One night they came, no announcement, no ceremony, two figures, no uniforms, no emblems. They did not speak as they lifted him to his feet. He asked no questions. He knew. They led him not to the main hall, not to a public square, but to a secluded courtyard behind the villa. It was dusk. The air was cold and smelled of wet earth and olive oil. Torches lined the stone path, like mourners flickering against the onyx sky. There was no crowd, no audience. Only three witnesses: the priestess who once warned him, a man with a ledger, and the executioner face, veiled hands steady. They had taken his name. Now they would take his face. His hands were tied behind his back. Not tightly, no need. He offered no struggle. He stood tall. There was no plea, no denial, only breath. The priestess stepped forward. In her hand was a scroll short and sealed with the mark of the emperor. "By the will of Caesar," she said, her voice barely louder than when you are condemned, not for what you did, but for what you know. Salenus met her eyes. "They'll forget me," he whispered. She blinked, and for a brief second, something flickered. Pity no, it was something colder. Resignation. They must. She stepped back. The executioner raised the blade, and then hesitated. A pause, as if the silence demanded one last word, but there was none. The sword came down. It was clean, almost quiet. A thud against stone, a gasp from no one, and then the sea breeze swept in as if to carry the last breath away. There was no burial, no rites. His body was taken to a furnace beneath the villa where waste was burned, not mourned. Ash and bone mixed and indistinguishable from refuse. The scrolls he had touched were removed from the archives, sealed in resin, and buried in a chamber no one dared name. The ledger with his sentence was scratched clean, overwritten by another name, another fate. Even the statue they had once commissioned of him, a gift from a visiting senator, perhaps was quietly removed from the garden, its face scraped off, its torso broken and repurposed as raw material for a pillar. No one spoke his name again, not aloud, not in Rome, but in the corridors of Capri, whispers clung to the marble. Some claimed he had cursed the emperor with his final breath. Others said he had written letters that still existed buried somewhere deep. A few, only a few, claimed to have seen a second figure that night, slipping away through the shadows with a bundle of scrolls hidden beneath their robes. What is truth? What is story? Does it matter if the end is the same? He died alone, erased, not for any crime he committed, but for bearing witness to the crimes others swore never to admit. And still, somehow, something remained. In the silence, in the gaps, in the void where his name once was. Rome did not speak of him again. Officially, he never existed. The scrolls were sealed or burned. The witnesses were silenced, reassigned, or themselves made to vanish. To name him Salenus, or whatever his true name may have been, was to invite suspicion, or worse, reflection. And Rome did not reward reflection. Rome rewarded obedience. But erasure is never perfect. Centuries later, fragments began to surface. In the footnotes of disgraced senators' letters, in the marginalia of monastic codices copied in forgotten abbeys, in the graffiti scratched into villa walls preserved by the ash of Vesuvius. A single name misspelled, distorted, but repeated with strange reverence. Salenus, Saleno, Saleno, and always near it the image of an eye, watching, waiting. One account written in the early 3rd century by a minor historian named Domitius Verus describes a young man of profound beauty and dangerous memory who served the second Caesar in private only to become his undoing in soul, if not in state. Verus does not offer details. Perhaps he didn't know them, perhaps he feared them. But he ends the passage with a warning. Those who live in the shadow of emperors must never speak of the light they saw, for the light once named must be extinguished. That may have been the true crime Salenus committed, not defiance, not theft, but seeing too much and remembering it too clearly. The island of Capri remains, of course. The ruins of Villa Jovis still overlook the cliffs. Tourists walk the same paths, unaware of the stories buried beneath their feet. The imperial court, the chambers, the archive halls, all gone. But stone has memory, even when man forgets. Occasionally guides mention Tiberius's retreat into eccentricity. Few say more. Fewer still mention the rooms sealed off during restoration rooms with strange markings etched into marble. Circles, lines, a name half carved then abandoned. There is no tomb for Salenus, no cenotaph, no statue restored, but perhaps legacy is not always found in monuments. Perhaps it endures in silence, in the haunting sense that something was lost and that it mattered. Because for all Rome tried to forget him, the traces remain. In the shape of a statue with no face, in the missing pages of an emperor's ledger, in the stories whispered just out of reach of a boy who dared to speak, who saw behind the veil, and who paid with everything. Some say he died meaningless, but that's not true. He became a question Rome could never answer, and that is a kind of immortality no empire can kill. His name was erased, his story buried, and yet you're still here listening, because something about Silenus lingers not as a hero, not even as a martyr, but as a haunting reminder of what power fears most truth spoken from the mouth of the powerless. And if one erased life can echo across centuries, how many others have been forgotten beneath the marble floors of history? If this story disturbed you, if it made you angry, curious, or even just quietly unsettled, then you need to hear what happened to another silenced figure, a woman they called the Emperor's Mirror. She vanished the same year Tiberius died, and her body was never found. Click here to uncover her fate and what it reveals about how far Rome would go to silence those who saw too much. And if you believe stories like Silenus's deserve to be remembered, subscribe. There are more voices buried beneath empires, and we intend to dig them up one by one.